Hi everyone, this is Ryan Reagan, the founding partner of HKExcel. So if you're watching this video right now, I assume you're probably an IB student who's striving to get a level 7 or at least a level 6 in IB Economics, and you're finding it a bit difficult. That's why you're finding help on YouTube. Okay, so the reason why I'm making this video today is because recently what I've noticed is that IB Economics exams have gotten harder and harder. Actually, that makes a lot of sense because as the year goes on, there are more and more past exam questions for students to practice with, right? So IB knows that. So IB students are actually getting smarter and smarter every year because there are more past papers for them to prepare with, right? So it's like, now IB, because they know that more and more students are doing past papers, they can't allow everyone to get a 7, obviously, right? It wouldn't work. The whole system would fall apart if everyone got level 7, right? So that's why they need to make it harder, so that even if you do the past exam questions, you wouldn't be able to get a level 7 without critical thinking, right? So what I've noticed is that the IB requires more and more critical thinking from students to make it harder, so that even if you do past papers, it's not really good enough, right? So today, what I really want to teach you is the critical thinking skills that are required to do really well in IB Economics in the newest exams, right? Because I've noticed this as a trend. The questions are getting more harder and harder, less predictable, and also requires more critical thinking skills, okay? So, what exactly got hardest in the IB exam? I would say it's the paper 1, the evaluation question in paper 1. Now it's a lot harder. It's starting to feel a bit like TOK questions even, right? It's harder and harder to answer. You need more critical thinking skills. Before it was just like evaluate in direct text. It's very easy. Advantage, disadvantage. Now the question always has a twist, okay? So I'm going to show you how you can do well in these types of questions, okay? What I'll do, I'll show you 3 common question types that showed up in recent IB questions, like these 2 years, that are quite difficult, okay? And students struggle to answer. And I'll show you how you can go about doing it and get it. Also, this video is for more advanced students who want to get 6 or 7s. But if you want the basic tips, like the basic tips for all papers, actually I made another video a few years ago, which is still applicable today, very applicable today. I'll put the link in the description, okay? That video will teach you more basic skills, but this video is for the advanced critical thinking skills. Before I continue into my video, I'd like to bring to your attention that if you look at the description, whether you're a student in Hong Kong or overseas, just go to our description. There are a lot of free resources for you to download, and there are also a lot of trial lessons you can register for with our IB expert, because our IB experts will give you one-on-one interaction and really cater to your situation, okay? And in the trial lesson, we'll give you the IB, like our IB question bank, okay, mock exam question bank, our notes, and also we will break down complicated concepts for you, and also teach you specific exam skills and help you to improve, okay? So now, without further ado, let's get into the core of the video, which are the skills. First type of question that really started to show up in the recent year exam, in the IB exam, goes in the format of this. Evaluate that XXX is the best or most for XYYY, okay? So, for examples are written here. Evaluate that growth is best achieved by improvement in technology. Okay, so whether growth is best way to achieve growth is best achieved by technology. Okay, the second example is evaluate that monetary policy is the best way to reduce inflation. Okay, so whether using monetary policy is the best to reduce inflation. Number 3, evaluate that loss in export competitiveness is the most significant cost of inflation. Okay, so these types of questions, what is the way to answer them? Okay, so for example, I'll give you the general framework, critical thinking first, okay? So because it says growth is best achieved by improvement in technology. So obviously there are many ways to achieve growth, and you need to evaluate whether technology is the best, okay? So obviously, what are some things you need to talk about? You need to talk about how technology contributes to growth, okay? How improvement in technology leads to growth. But then because the question says growth is best achieved, right? So that's why you definitely have to consider other ways to achieve growth as well. Okay, so you need to consider other ways to achieve growth. Okay, and because it asks you whether it is the best, you need to make a comparison. Okay, you need to make a comparison. So you need to have an evaluation about whether technology is really the best. You need to compare to other ways to achieve growth. It's the same for example 3 and example 2. Like for example, in example 3, it says export loss in export competitiveness is the most significant cost of inflation. So there are obviously many cost of inflation. And you need to explain all the cost of inflation and then evaluate whether loss in export competitiveness is the most significant one. Okay, so I'll give you an example. Evaluate whether exercising is the best way to keep fit. Okay, so if you're faced with an answer like that, how would you answer it? So obviously you need to talk about, okay, keeping fit can help you to exercising can help you to keep fit. Then you can use scientific data to back that up. And then you need to also talk about other ways you can keep fit. So for example, you can talk about I don't know, eating less, okay, or what else are there? Like exercising more, eat less, use medication, right? These sorts of things. I need to compare which is the best way. Okay, evaluate. So talk about the advantages and disadvantages of all ways to keep fit, and then you need to come up with a conclusion, a reasonable conclusion, whether or not exercising is the best way. Okay, so I'm using this layman example just to show you the critical thinking behind. In economics, actually, the logic is just the same. Okay, so I'll show you how I would answer example 1. Okay, so these are the steps, as you can see in the screen. First, you need to explain how technology improvement boosts growth. Okay, so obviously, how technology improves growth. Oh, by the way, so there are a lot of economic concepts in these evaluations, right? So I'm teaching you the critical thinking skills, but if you don't know the knowledge, if you don't have the knowledge, even if you have critical thinking, you can't answer these questions well. So that's why, apart from critical thinking skills, you need to actually know your stuff. Okay, you need to actually know the concepts in your mind. Okay, so that's why. Okay, so let's get to it. Explain how technology improvement boosts growth. Okay, so the logic behind this is that technology is going to increase the productivity of the capital goods, physical capital, right? Which are like, for example, machinery. Okay, so it improves the productivity of capital goods, and then therefore it will increase the LRAS, and then it's going to, so you can draw a diagram for this. It's going to increase the LRAS and therefore increase the real GDP in the long run. Okay, but then, as I said, you need to evaluate whether technology improvement is really that great to boost growth. Okay, so what are some disadvantages? You can talk about structural unemployment, right? A lot of times, technological advancements leads to structural unemployment because, like, technology leads to a decrease in the demand for certain types of labor. So, for example, self-driving cars is going to cause structural unemployment for drivers. Okay. The other one you can talk about is that technological improvement often takes a long time to take effect. So it takes a long time for technology to be mature to a state where it can actually increase the economic growth. So it generally takes a long time. So for example, self-driving cars, it have been worked on for the past few years already, but it's still not yet in the market. It's still not yet really usable in the consumer, not really usable in the market. So that's why it generally takes a long time for a technology improvement to really boost economic growth. Okay, so that's a disadvantage. Another thing you can talk about is that even if improvement in technology can increase economic growth, but there also needs to be sufficient human capital in order to achieve economic growth. So for example, if there is a very advanced technology, but if human capital is poor, the economic growth is still going to be limited. Okay, so for example, you can talk about how in rural areas, in less developed parts of China, there is often very advanced technology available. However, due to the lack of human capital, those advanced technology cannot be fully utilized. Okay, so so now we have considered how technology improvement boosts growth. So now let's look at point 3. Investment in human capital. So how does investment in human capital boost growth? Well, so you can talk about what are some investment in human capital, like for example, improvement in healthcare and education. These two things can increase the labor productivity and therefore increase the LRAS, right? But so what are the advantages and disadvantages in this? Well, you can talk about how actually if you have improvement in human capital, that actually reduces structural unemployment as opposed to increase it, because if people are more educated, they can more likely find new jobs even if they're structurally unemployed. Okay. Second point, it improves standards of living because education and healthcare are the key components of key aspects of living standards. Okay, but then you can also say it requires good technology and physical capital to maximize labor productivity. So what that means is that even if labor productivity is very high, if there's lack of technology and physical capital, the labor productivity is going to be limited. So it's kind of similar to what we said just now. Okay, and obviously investment in technology takes a long time to take effect, to be paid back, right? Yeah. So now, what are other ways to achieve growth? So now we've looked at different supply side methods, right? Number one is technology, then human capital. Then we can also look at natural resources, which is land, which is another factor of production. So land, of course, if land is being improved, it can increase the LRES because it's one of the factors of production, right? LRES increases. So that's how we explained how discovering natural resources boosts economic growth, right? But what are the advantages and disadvantages of that? So it's not sustainable in the long run because there's always a finite amount of natural resources in this planet, right? So that's why it's not really a sustainable way to do it, to achieve economic growth, okay? And also, it's another similar point you can make is that it requires physical and human capital to make use of natural resources. So even if a country has abundant natural resources that can be discovered, if there isn't sufficient human capital and physical capital, it's not really enough to boost economic growth, right? Like it's not the so you get the idea. Natural resources cannot be fully utilized if there are not sufficient human and physical capital. Okay. Then you can also explain how demand-side policy can achieve growth, right? So we have looked at supply-side things. Demand-side policy can also achieve growth by increasing the AD. Right? You can draw the diagram showing AD rising. The advantage and the disadvantage, the major one, is that it's demand-side policy can only increase growth in the short run, right? If you know the neoclassical model, you know that if the AD increase, ultimately it will go back to the full employment. You can look at the ADAS chapter if you forgot about this, right? So demand-side policy can only increase growth in the short run, right? But the advantage is that compared to improvement technology takes a long time to take effect. But demand-side policy can have a more immediate impact on economic growth. So that's an advantage as well. Okay. So what would be the conclusion? Is technology really the best way? So I think what we can say is that in the short run, technology advancements cannot improve economic growth. So demand-side improvements is the best way to achieve growth in the short run. Okay, how about the long run? In the long run, I would argue actually that improvement in human capital and discovery of natural resources and improvement in technology are all very important to achieve economic growth. So you can't achieve economic growth in the long run if you're lacking in human capital or in technology or in natural resources. So that's why I would argue that human capital, natural resources, and technology are all equally important in terms of achieving economic growth because all three are necessary to achieve economic growth. The second type of question, which I think is slightly easier, okay? So this type of question is a should or should not type of question, or another way of asking it is and is not. So for example, I'll give you an example, layman example. So for example, discuss the view that what's an example? Discuss the view that children should go to school. Okay, so that would be a should or should not question, right? Is or is not. So discuss the view that going to school is the best alternative for children to obtain education, right? So these are examples of should or should not, is and is not question. Okay, how about in economics? So you can see these are some clear examples. Okay, evaluate the view that the government, sorry, there's some typo here. Evaluate the view that the government should intervene in the housing market. Evaluate the view that the government should provide public goods. So it's all should or should not. Number 3, discuss the view that producers and not consumers receive the most benefit in an oligopoly. Yeah, so you can see, the way you answer this question is basically you think of the arguments for and arguments against, right? So for example, discuss the first. Well, let's use the first one as a quick example. Evaluate the view that the government should intervene in the housing market. So you can think about reasons why they should intervene and reasons why they should not intervene, and then come up with their conclusion at the end, whether they should intervene or should not intervene. Okay. So now I'll use the third example. Discuss the view that producers and not consumers receive the most benefit. Or actually another way of asking this question is the major beneficiary. Is the major beneficiary in an oligopoly market. So we look at for and against. So argument 4, you can see it, the paragraph I highlighted here. So what does it mean if we're arguing for the statement? It means that we argue that producers benefit most and the consumers are worse off. This would be supporting the statement. Okay? So there are a number of reasons why producers and not consumers is the major beneficiary. So these are the reasons for, all written here. So number 1 is abnormal profits, right? You know, oligopoly, there can be abnormal profits because of barriers of entry. Abnormal profits in the long run, yeah. But this is one reason why producers can benefit significantly from an oligopoly. Secondly, they can collude and act as a monopoly, right? If they act as a monopoly, they can earn abnormal profits in the long run, and they can share their profits according to market share, right? And they can, if they act as a monopoly, they can raise price even further, right? And gain even higher profits, right? This, and you can add, this is illegal, but it's often difficult to enforce, right? And this is also detrimental to consumers because when firms collude, they can actually set very high prices, right? And then this is detrimental to consumers' interest. Okay, so this was argument 4 as well. So another, how else do producers benefit? So it's because economies of scale can be gained by oligopoly because they're by nature large firms. And then economies of scale can allow firms to have even greater profits. So these are all the arguments for, right? Of course, you also need real-life examples to answer your questions, as you probably know and I've explained in my previous videos, right? So for example, what are some examples of collusion? So for example, airline companies during the 2010 World Cup have been accused of colluding, right? Because the airline industry is an oligopoly, and during the World Cup there is a high demand. So during that period of time, they decided to collude to charge higher prices to mutually maximize their profits, right? So that's an example, right? And then arguments against. So what is arguing against this view? The view that producers and not consumers is the major beneficiary. So obviously, you should talk about the benefits to consumer. How does it benefit the consumer? Non-price competition. Like, for example, the smartphone market. The smartphone market is an oligopoly, right? The smartphone market, non-price competition have led to a lot of innovation and consumer choice, which is beneficial to consumers. And then you can use the smartphone example again for R&Ds, right? So oligopoly can earn abnormal profits. Therefore, they can achieve R&D, and R&D often benefits the consumers, right? Leading to better products and higher quality products and innovation. And then you can also, economies of scale, just now we mentioned it can increase the profit for producers, right? But actually it can also bring down prices for consumers, right? Yeah, there's a diagram to show that. You should be able to find it in your textbook. Yeah, this video is for the critical thinking, but the diagram you can find in your textbook. Now, so what's the conclusion? So conclusion, obviously I would say it depends, right? Because it depends on whether non-price competition and R&D exist in a way that benefits the consumer. So for example, in the smartphone market, I'm going to argue that in the smartphone market, in fact, there's significant R&D and non-price competition, and actually the consumers are significantly benefited as well, right? But on the other hand, in airline industry, there isn't really much there isn't significant non-price competition, and there's not really R&D that benefits the consumers. Therefore, like a collusive oligopoly in the airline industry often is worse off for the consumers, right? Number 2, it also depends on whether collusion exists, right? So if collusion exists, typically consumers are going to be worse off. But if collusion does not exist, then there aren't, what's the right way to say it? If collusion does not exist, prices can be lower for consumers, and consumers are better off if there is not collusion, right? So it depends on whether there's collusion. So I would say in the end, in many cases of oligopoly, consumers are also benefited, like in the smartphone, like for example, in the game console industry, which is another oligopoly, etc. You can give some examples. Yeah, because R&D often exists and because there's often non-price competition. And there is also laws to protect against collusion, which makes it more difficult for firms to collude. This is why this is why consumers are often benefited. Let's look at the last type of question we're going to do today. This is probably the hardest type. Okay, so it says examine the role of XXX and YYY. That's the way they're going to phrase the question. For example, examine the role of studying in getting a level 7. Okay, so some real example in the IB exam. Examine the role of PED in maximizing revenue. Examine the role of barrier of entry in earning abnormal profit. Okay, so just to give you the critical thinking skills that you need. For example, how would you answer? Evaluate the role of studying in getting a level 7. So obviously you need to first talk about the reasons why studying is important. Okay, so studying is help you get a level 7 because practice makes perfect, right? Numerous studies have shown that the more the student studies, the higher chance there is to get a level 7, blah blah blah. Okay, but we can also say, however, there are a number of reasons why studying may not be that important. Number one, the effectiveness of studying plays a vital role. So it's not just the hours that the students study. We also need to look at whether the studying is effective. Look at whether the student have the right studying habits, etc. Then we can also talk about innate talent or smartness might also be very important in getting a level 7. So even if a student studies a lot and very hard, if he's not very smart to begin with, he will have difficulties getting a level 7. And then we can also talk about, for example, so what are some reasons why studying is not important? Are there other factors that are more important, right? So for example, maybe we can say getting a tutor is actually more important because getting a tutor will teach students exam skills that they didn't know before, right, etc. So you get the idea. We need to look at the reasons why it's important and the reasons why it may not be so important. Okay, so now let's try to look at it from an econ standpoint. So we'll try to answer this question. Examine the role of barrier of entry in earning abnormal profit. So why is it important? If you studied it, you should study market structure, you should know. Whenever a market has high barriers of entry, producers can earn abnormal profit in the long run because the barriers of entry can prevent new firms from entering the market, and it can limit competition in the market. And this is why it decides whether a firm can earn abnormal profits in the long run. This is in theory. So you can talk about how, for example, use perfect competition or monopolistic competition as an example. Because in perfect competition or monopolistic competition, there is low barriers of entry. This is why, in theory, firms in monopolistic competition or perfect competition can never earn abnormal profits in the long run, right? Because you can draw a diagram for the perfect competition to show it. And then you can also talk about, on the other hand, in monopoly and oligopoly, because there's high barriers of entry, right? In oligopoly and monopoly, there's high barriers of entry. That's why in the long run, there won't be increased competition for the firm. So that's why they can continue to earn abnormal profits, right? So this is the main reason why it's so important in theory. But what reasons why it may not be that important? Why it may not play a significant role? Well, one we can say is that barriers of entry are not permanent and can be eroded. So it's like even if a firm has seemed to have barrier of entry now, it may not. The barrier of entry may eventually erode in the long run, and then this means that even an oligopoly, even if it currently has high barriers of entry, in the long run, those barriers of entry may erode, causing them to not earn abnormal profits. For example, you can argue. Let me think of an example. So for example, Nokia used to have high barriers of entry, right? They had they had advanced technology, which was proprietary, and they also had a strong brand loyalty. But eventually, as Apple invented the smartphone, their brand loyalty eroded, their technological barrier eroded, and therefore, they're not able to earn abnormal profits anymore, right? So this is one reason why barrier of entry may not be that important. Another thing is that, so in the previous paragraph, we talked about how firms in monopolistic competition cannot earn abnormal profits in theory, right? But if you look in reality, actually there are a lot of monopolistic competition firms that actually earn abnormal profits. So what's monopolistic competition? Like a market with low barriers of entry in many firms, right? But there are still firms in these markets that earn abnormal profits. For example, McDonald's earns significant profits. They're in the restaurant market. Restaurant market is like the monopolistic competition. It's supposed to be very competitive with low barriers of entry, and yet McDonald's can still earn abnormal profits. So the point here is that, so in reality, even firms in monopolistic competition can earn significant amounts of profits in the long run, which is arguably abnormal profit, through good business practices to increase the market demand and minimize cost. So the point here is that even if barriers of entry is low, it does not mean that the firm cannot earn abnormal profit in reality. You can use McDonald's as an example. And then finally, you can say, actually, there are many factors deciding whether a firm can earn abnormal profits or not, right? Barrier of entry is just one of the many factors. So that's why this also diminishes the importance of barrier of entry. So what's the conclusion here? Is it really that important? Well, one thing that's clear is that barrier of entry is more important in the short run than in the long run than in the short run, right? Even according to the theory, barrier of entry determines whether firms can earn abnormal profit in the long run. In the short run, even if there's low barriers of entry, firms can earn abnormal profit. So it's more important in the long run than in the short run. That's clear. Then I think another thing you should make clear is that in theory at least, barrier of entry is the key factor to decide whether a firm can earn abnormal profit in the long run. But in reality, there are many factors determining the firm's level of profit. Therefore, barrier of entry is just one of the many factors that decides a firm's profits. Okay? So I hope this lesson helped you to consolidate your critical thinking skills. Okay, if you need the free resources to boost your IB grade, refer to the description below. There are a lot of free resources on the offering. That will help you tremendously. Okay, so see you next time.